And what we're trying to understand is how we improve market mechanisms to develop better quality jobs in the global economy, with a focus in particular on those without a college education, for whom the last 40 years have been very tough. Within that broader set of aims, we have a specific interest in places that have fallen on hard times. The deindustrialization of high-income countries, now the beginnings of deindustrialization in emerging economies, has created pockets of regional distress, which are surprisingly long-lasting. So I'm going to talk to you about is a bit of our conceptual approach to thinking about how we go about policy design in this context, and then tell you about what we know and don't know about the effectiveness of place-based policies in dealing with these issues, and then give you our plan of action and kind of tell you where we are in the stream of things. So this is, I'm not trying to pitch a set of results to you today. I'm trying to pitch an approach. And as a consequence of that, the feedback I get from you is enormously valuable because we're really in early stages. So there are many ways to motivate what we're doing. My own frame revolves around what's happened to local labor markets in the US over the past 3 decades. And what we've seen is the entrenchment of joblessness, by which I mean low employment to population ratios that fall as a consequence of some shock. So in my own work, I've studied the China trade shock and its impact on manufacturing employment and how that has then translated into the absence of employment creation in different places. But there's a growing list of things that are responsible for regional economic distress. Manufacturing decline in general, which began way before the most recent wave of globalization picked up steam, was important. So you think about, you look around New England, and we have cities like Lawrence and Lowell and Holyoke and Springfield, all of which lost manufacturing jobs after 1960 and had a very hard time bouncing back. You go to New Bedford today, which at one point was one of the richest cities in the world, center of the whaling industry, then was able to transition into textile and footwear production. Today, outside of a small tourist pocket near the port, is a place that is where joblessness and despair have been present for a couple of decades. Technological change matters here, and now we have the ongoing energy transition. Now, this energy transition isn't a new thing. Decarbonization is accelerating it, but the movement away from coal began a couple of decades ago, and that wasn't a movement towards coal, towards non-fossil fuel-based industry, but just a move towards new forms of fossil fuels, natural gas in particular. So if we add up all of these shocks and then look at the regions that have been affected by them, what we see, and here is I'm showing you in dark blue, are places where we saw substantial declines in the employment to population ratio since 1990. Now, why do I focus on this one particular measure? The employment to population ratio is as close as you can get to a summary statistic for the economic health of a place. So you think about any economic model that tells us about labor supply. Labor supply is a function of the real wage that workers can command in the marketplace. If that real wages are difficult to measure, we can see nominal earnings, but there's all sorts of issues with unobserved characteristics of people. We can see some local prices, but a lot of local prices we can't. So detecting real wages with a great deal of precision is tough. But if real wages are low, people won't work. And so that's where the employment to population ratio comes in as a very simple indicator. Now, it's all the more powerful in the US context because its variation across place is enormous. And the changes in the employment to population ratio have been large over the past few decades. And so that is a signal of a reduction in labor demand that hasn't been followed by the successful transition of workers into new lines of activity. And that's the core, one of the core policy challenges we want to address.
Why do you focus or start at 1990?
As I'll talk about, we're going to go way back. The story starts in 1910. In 1910, we industrialization is not quite complete in the US North. And our focus just isn't on the US. I'll weave in stories from other countries as well. And there the timing really matters. So industrialization in the US North really takes off in the late 1800s, keeps going at a steady pace during the first half of the 20th century. You get to 1960, and that's when manufacturing starts to decline in lots of high-income countries as a share of employment, not in terms of as a share of GDP, but as a share of employment. And so part of the story that we're going to be looking at is, well, how did northern cities adjust to the exodus of manufacturing jobs from 1960 to 1990, before the China shock happened, before 1980, before skill-biased technological change was a thing? We know that places that were specialized in manufacturing in 1960 had a bad couple of decades after that. We actually don't know a lot about the nature of labor market adjustment to those shocks, pre-1990 shocks. One of the things we want to try and understand is, are there some useful lessons about successful adjustment to some of those older shocks that we might be able to apply today? So we're going to take as our first set of analyses, we'll take as a laboratory the US local labor markets going back over the past 100 years and understanding the decline of manufacturing and traditional energy jobs and some other traditional industrial jobs on local economies and how they adjusted and what were the things that made adjustment more successful. So there I list a few of the shocks that people have studied. And in this work, in my past work, I've been very interested in specific types of shocks for the purposes of identification. You want to know that you've got an exogenous source of variation in local labor demand so that you can then study what happens. Well, we know all of that now. And so if you just use a simple Bartik measure of the projected decline in manufacturing employment for a case, what you see is, we know this work from Irwin Charles, Eric Hurst, and Anna Schwartz, that the broader declines in manufacturing really mirror adjustment to the China shock. So it's about the loss of good jobs for people without a college education. That's so painful. So the sets of economic ills that come out of this include, one, what could be a spatial misallocation of resources. We've got people stuck in places with low employment rates and other people thriving in places with high employment rates. So Boston versus Holyoke. Holyoke and Boston aren't that far apart. Are there barriers to the movements of capital or labor or technology between those two places, or entrepreneurial talent between those places? And if those barriers exist, then we've got a source of inefficiency. Then we've got some endogenous processes at work with agglomeration of forces having been ever present since humans discovered that cities were a good thing. But those agglomeration of forces really seems to have changed since the 80s and 90s and are now really anchored in the concentration of highly educated workers. And that's both due to sets of spillovers on the production side, or traditional Marshallian externalities that seem to be a little more skilled worker centric, but also on the consumption side. When you gather lots of bright young people together, they then generate demand for the urban amenities that attract other bright young people to come there. If we then get this separation, you get the entrenchment of spatial inequality. And as we have learned, that has real political consequences. The rise of support for populist nationalist politicians in the US, in France, Germany, the UK, is concentrated in places where we've seen greater manufacturing job loss. This then rolls over into a whole bunch of attendant social consequences. So the work of Ann Case and Angus Deaton about deaths of despair. Manufacturing job loss and coal and other things isn't the only thing responsible for those deaths of despair, but it contributes to it, and we've got a growing body of work that shows that. So what do we do in the face of these issues? One is do kind of what we're doing now, and that is just let market forces work. And market forces will do their thing. It takes a long time. So think about Pittsburgh and the loss of steel manufacturing, which began in the 1960s and picked up pace in the 1970s. Pittsburgh has come back. It's come back at about 60% of its former size. It's come back with a very different composition of people, and it's come back like after 2000. So you had like a good 30 years of time in the doldrums. And one of our concerns about that is you got a whole generation of kids that are raised in that environment, and that means loss of economic opportunity for them. So then when it comes to policy, the traditional approach is to treat people and not places. And how do we treat people? We can treat people either by conditioning on their labor market status at a given moment in time. Are you unemployed? And then we might condition the nature of that aid on labor market conditions. And the way this works in the US is pretty stingy unemployment insurance that gets generous when the national economy is in recession. Other economies handle this quite differently. And Britain is a little bit more generous than the US, but kind of the same story. Denmark takes a very different approach in terms of what we do about the unemployed. The challenge with the way we've dealt with unemployment is that we tune generosity to what's happening to the national labor market. A lot of this manufacturing job loss has happened off cycle. It's happened actually during periods when the national economy is expanding. And so what you have is the lack of generosity and the short duration of benefits mean that you're just not doing much on the ground to help folks. We also have means-tested entitlement programs. And so that includes Medicaid, so you can get access to subsidized healthcare. It includes negative income taxes, the earned income tax credit in the United States. It includes food stamps. There are two challenges with these programs in terms of addressing areas in economic distress in practice. One issue is that we've simply dismantled a lot of these programs, starting with welfare reform in 1986. And we devolved lots of autonomy to states in terms of their design and their generosity. And the states that chose to be least generous happened to be the states where this job loss, the post-2000 job loss in particular, was most acute. The second challenge is that there's a running conflict in US social policy in terms of, is it about helping people in poverty, which those on the left advocate, or is it about helping families and children, which those on the right advocate? The confluence of those two forces creates a system that heavily conditions aid in practice to having kids in the household. In an environment where job loss is endemic and male employment rates in particular have fallen, men become less attractive marriage partners. So we've seen an increase in single-headedness over this time period, overwhelmingly dominated by women being at home, women living with their kids. And what that has meant is that men who have suffered negative shocks have access to pretty paltry policies in terms of allowing themselves to adjust. So whatever we think about the effectiveness of treating people, in theory, in practice, we haven't done a lot of it. Now, the other approach is to treat regions. And we'll talk all about kind of what we know about the pitfalls of place-based policies. And whereas the former is trying to help workers move to jobs, the second is helping move jobs to workers. And here, you all know this well in the Growth Lab. You've got your Wyoming project up and running. There's lots of experimentation happening on the ground. That's what this project's about.
So there's a question from the Zoom. So can you repeat the trend when program-made power transferred from federal to states, like what happened?
So in 1996, Bill Clinton promised to end welfare as we know it in the United States. And he did. He did a really good job in fulfilling that promise. So what that meant was that the federal government would continue to support certain federal programs, but there were new sets of conditions. One was a 5-year lifetime limit on certain sorts of aid and pretty much all the cash-based aid. So direct income support to low-income families was capped at 5 years. The second thing that happened was saying, we're not going to tell states how to administer this aid. We're going to give them a block grant. And then they can decide, and the block grants will go for food stamps, or the block grants will go for temporary assistance to needy families, or the block grants will go to Medicaid. And then states can decide what they want to do. They can add money, or they can not add money. And so you now had an environment in which states had more autonomy over how much they added on, and there was a sharp variation across states in how much they did. This gets at a long-running tension in the US over social policy, with states in the US North tending to be more generous, states in the US South tending to be less generous, states in the West kind of somewhere between the two. In parts of the US West, we have rugged individualism at work and there's little government support. And then we have California, which is taking kind of Bulgaria in 1957 as its model for economic policy. And so after 1996, what happened then was, in effect, a reduction in the overall level of federal support for social welfare programs, but also a lot of regional unevenness based on the choices that states were making. So this project, a big part of this project is understanding the experimentation that's happening at the local level, with the federal government doing much less, and now states and localities left to figure stuff out. So how do we justify place-based policy?
Sorry, quick question on this. You seem to take as a given low geographic labor mobility. What's the reason for that? Because you could think of a fourth pillar, which would be let's move people.
Yeah. Here,
is that the next slide?
This is this slide.
Perfect.
So perfect time.
Thank you.
You know, the reason we kind of missed all of this, the reason we didn't think that globalization and technological change and the energy transition were going to create pockets of distress, is that we thought of the US economy in particular as being highly geographic. And it was up until 1980, but that wasn't what you could should think of as steady state mobility. It was mobility that was occurring during a period in which the US was still completing its transition to a spatial steady state. Now, it's not that there was still substantial rural to urban migration going on, although there was a bit. It was the US is filling out California, the West and the South. The US is filling out California, Texas, and Florida, and that meant there's very strong labor demand. And that helped grease the wheels for economies that were subject to shocks in that time period. And so Kyle Magnum at the Philadelphia Fed has some really good work helping us understand how we misinferred the nature of geographic labor mobility before 1980, 1990, because we took at that as a steady state phenomenon, and it wasn't. It was part of a transition. So then you get after 1990, and what we've seen is kind of in the last 30 years, this steady decline in mobility. So there are two ways to understand that, and we're not really sure what mix of the two gives us the fullest representation. One is that there are fixed costs to moving, there's uncertainty, there is the absence of social insurance, making reliant on family and also for childcare. We've got now mom and dad not living together, and so needing relatives around to take care of the kids or yourself when you're sick. We've got all of these imperfections, which mean that there's stuff that we don't observe. Your attachment to place gets stronger. In that environment, what we have is a disequilibrium in some sense, in which we have differences in real earnings across place. There's another view that comes along and says, well, Enrico Moretti has been writing about this on his own, and then recently with Rebecca Diamond, say, well, if you actually look at variation in housing prices across place, that variation is huge. So when you look at actual differences in real earnings, it may not be that big. what's happening then, but that doesn't mean that intervention isn't justified. Intervention could still be justified because what we have at work behind that separation is a set of spillovers which lead to the overconcentration of innovation and high-skilled workers in superstar cities. Give me one more second. So you then have which story it is matters, because what do we want to do? Do we want to move workers out of distressed labor markets, or do we want to move skilled workers in? And there's a set of theoretical papers. One paper by Cecile Gobert and Pablo Papelbaum, another paper by Adrian Bilal, which they kind of have complementary but distinct frameworks about the nature of the externalities at work. And getting it right matters, because do we treat workers? Do we treat firms? Do we treat places? And we don't really know.
Oh, I was also going to ask, in the 60s and 70s, we assumed that maybe movement was the norm, but maybe it was just kind of part of the process. Also, that's when a lot of the Reagan era immigration kind of flooded us certain pockets of places. So how does some of that lead to this inequality entrenchment that you also mentioned before?
Yeah, so the large-scale immigration, so immigration kind of reaches its peak as a share of the US population in 1910 at 15%, foreign-born share of the US population, and then declines until 1970. And so in 1970, it's down to 5%. Then changes in US immigration policy, and then shifts in what's happening in Mexico and the incentive to migrate to the United States that leads to the most recent US immigration wave, which peaked 15 years ago. I know we've got a lot going on at the border right now, but immigration peaked a while ago. And so it's that kind of 1965 to 2005 period where that big immigration wave happened. Much of it happened in the 90s and 2000s in terms of the quantities. The rate of growth was really fast in the 80s, but the big numbers happened in the 90s and 2000s. That may have impeded the mobility of US foreign workers in terms of moving to places to take advantage of those jobs. Because newly arrived immigrants, we know this from the work of George Borjas, are a lot more responsive to variation in economic opportunities.
Yeah.
So that layers on top.
We have two questions from Zoom. So one question is related to the decline of property values. So do you think like this wealth
Decline of what?
property values
Yeah.
in the declining communities? So the property values go down, the wealth effect, because of the wealth effect, it might be harder for them to move. But does the declining property values affect the significant portion of the lack of mobility in these communities?
So this is something we're going to look at, and just as a methodological point, we think of it as hard to study changes in housing prices over time because there's so much variation and it's endogenous what gets sold at any moment in time. In practice, as is often the case in economics, our obsession with selection effects is overdone. And if you look at changes in housing prices that you get from taking data from the US Census and simply adjusting for number of rooms, age at which something was built, and the observable things, the changes in property values you get out of that series and out of the high quality resale series, which we only have for the past couple decades, super, super high. So going backwards in time, we can then say something about what all of this looks like. Property prices decline, a number of things happen. One is it helps offset the decline in local wages. And so what that means, so that disincentivizes moving. The other thing that happens is that it allows for a form of self-insurance. If you're in a high wage place and wages aren't rising, you can then move to a low wage place and you can kind of insulate yourself. So all of that means that the reasons for the housing price adjustment to dampen labor mobility. But we have some other things going on too, which matter for the long run and matter for what we think about kind of the overall efficiency of the outcome. One is that now we know that economic opportunity is highly place-based. And so if you think about what happens to the opportunities for the kids who grew up in these places, You got one world, we got access to, it's low wages, low housing prices. That means your tax base isn't that great. That means your schools aren't that good. That means that funding for regional public universities isn't that good. And you kind of evolve into providing the services that you can, or whatever tradable stuff you can do for bigger, richer places. So there is, even if it were efficient, we might be concerned from an equity perspective about the outcomes that result. But it may not be efficient in the presence of these spillovers. You get over concentration in superstar cities. There's something else that goes on too. Your home equity is collateral that you use to start new firms. We know that most net job growth comes from new firm creation. And as an aside, not all new firms, a tiny number of new firms. So we create lots of new firms. Most of them tank. A few of them don't. And a few that don't generate most of the net job growth. A lot of those new firms rely on home equity for collateral to get loans to do what they're going to do. The work by Davis and Halterwanger, building on a larger, earlier literature, shows that decline in property values reduces investments in new firm creation, and that impedes adjustment. And what that means is you can then, that reinforces this separation of what's happening in low wage, low house price, distressed places and other places. There, and that is indicative barriers to the mobility of capital, which is another source of inefficiency. And one of the things we're doing in the project is we've got data on the presence of US banks at the very local level going back about 30 years. And I know we've seen, there was some great work, I'm forgetting the person's name, who gave this great presentation on concentration of local banking here a couple of weeks ago. We're looking at something in parallel. You got a bunch of local labor markets in which a single bank accounts for 70, 80% of deposits. Now, they may or may not exercise market power on the lending side, but if those banks get whacked on their balance sheets by what's happening somewhere else, you're then interrupting the availability of capital in a place that really needs it to start new firms. And so what we then see here, to take all of this, is just lots of sources of inefficiency due to underappreciated barriers to the mobility of labor and the age-old problems of investments in capital, some perhaps surprising imperfections in the nature of capital markets, and our standard, well-known imperfections that come from the presence of these externalities. So that creates the potential for place-based policies to do something good. The potential, then getting it right, is a whole nother story. Okay, so we know that when it comes to looking at place-based policies, we have there are certainly examples of failure, which we tend to focus a bit more on. There are also examples of success. So Tennessee Valley Authority was created in the 1930s in the US in order to improve the economic livelihood of Appalachia. So this is a part of the US that was remote, had limited roads and highways and electrical generating facilities, and you had entrenched poverty. So Tennessee Valley Authority actually lasted for over half a century. Most of what it did was in about a 20-year period, and it built roads and canals and power plants and schools and connected Appalachia to the rest of the world. And that allowed some industry to move in. It allowed the region to transition out of agriculture into manufacturing at a moment in time when agriculture was releasing lots of labor. So that release of labor from agriculture from 1910 to 1960 is just mind-blowing. And it's this labor supply bonus. But if you don't have roads or power, that labor supply bonus does nothing. So what Klein and Moretti show in a 2014 paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics is that this did promote all of this great industrialization. In the aggregate, it's not clear it improved national welfare for the US overall, because So we kind of just moved from one tradable activity to another tradable activity. It didn't hurt. However, then if you want to if you care about inequality at all, there's no way this wasn't a really good thing. So we have to decide as a society what Pareto weights we place on income of people according to their well-being. Appalachian was really, really poor. So that's an example of success in my book, because even though the national efficiency outcomes are unclear, on the equity side, this one just seems really easy to justify. Then we have the development of practice and workforce development over the last 3 decades. A story which hasn't been kind of fully told. But what we now have is kind of well-recognized best practice. And that best practice, sometimes called active labor market programs, sometimes sectoral labor market programs, in which you identify workers in need. So this could be youth in underserved communities, it could be the long-run unemployed, and you do 2 things. First, you look at local employers in your place, and you work with them and say, what type of workers do you want to hire? What skills do you want them to have? And sometimes this happens through community colleges. Sometimes this happens through bespoke training programs. Sometimes this happens through private training institutes. And you provide those skills. And what's important here is to really work with employers. So the Industrial Areas Foundation, which was started by Saul Alinsky, who achieved fame for creating the community organizing framework that President Obama was a part of when he was a young person, and he was maligned for being a community organizer. One of the things that the Industrial Areas Foundation has grown into is building workforce development in communities with lots of low-income workers, mostly in the South and the Southwest. And they have been developing this program over the course of 30 years. Ernesto Cortez, one of the co-founders of this operation, was a MacArthur Genius Award winner in the 90s, received a prize from the Kennedy School in 1998, I think. So we kind of known what was the right thing to do for a long time. Larry Katz has a brand new paper with a team of co-authors here at Harvard in which he looks at some of the programs implemented by the Industrial Areas Foundation, Project Quest, and also 4 other programs, all of which were subject to RCTs. The other thing that these programs do is to provide wraparound services. So that means you encounter workers and find out what's going on with them. You assess their skills. You have to have some amount of screening. Employers are deeply skeptical of workforce development because they feel like you're peddling new workers rather than not listening to what my demands are. So you have screening, and that means drug tests and pretty low-level screening, drug tests and kind of some basic test course stuff. And then you provide career counseling. How do workers think about the future? That career counseling, we know from many different RCTs, including what Michela Carlana is doing in Italy right now, super important. And then you provide advice about how do you show up to work? What are the workforce habits that you need? How do you think about your career going forward? How do you think about advancing in your career? As problems come up on the job, how do you address those problems? And so the combination of those 2 things of targeted workforce, of targeted training and these wraparound services are just really effective. So over the studies that Katz et al. Look at, you have increases in hourly wages of between 15 and 35% over a 2-year time period, and they persist. But some of these programs can follow workers out 5 years, and you're not seeing attenuation effects. David Card and co-authors have just redone a meta-analysis of sectoral labor market programs. They look at 210 programs across 13 countries. Because they're looking at so many programs, they have to look at a narrower set of outcomes. So they're looking at the changes in employment rates. And what they find is that these sorts of active labor market programs work. The things that don't work, the biggest thing that doesn't work are public sector employment programs, in which you just pay people to have a job. And those do not work. So here's something I just learned that I had no idea about. the US in the 1970s, so US has had workforce development programs through government legislation since 1963. And each decade you get kind of a new piece of major legislation, which puts a new kind of paradigm in place. Current paradigm was really established in 1998 under Bill Clinton, and then it was modified by Barack Obama in 2014. But it was kind of consistent with this framework. There are issues with it, which I'll talk about in just a second. But in the 1970s, workforce development in the US was primarily subsidies for workers to have public sector jobs. The US, and that's where 60% of the funding for workforce development went. In 1978, there were 755,000 US workers on subsidized employment in the public sector paid for out of workforce development. So the practice here has evolved dramatically over time. The problem today with the way US does workforce development, it's not like Denmark does it. Denmark, you lose your job, you get generous unemployment insurance, and you get into what is in effect a national active labor market program right away. And so Denmark, even though it's much greater generosity, you see no increased incidence of non-employment associated with that generosity. The US, in kind of typical US fashion, devolves a lot of autonomy to states. So states get money, and then and those go to workforce development boards, about 650 of them in the US, and they give out vouchers to workers. Some of these workforce development boards are built into community colleges. They're responsive to what's going on in the community. They're great. Others are 1 or 2 person operations, which just are basically handing out vouchers. In other cases, these workforce development boards get captured by low-wage employers who say, free training, sign us up. And then that money gets diverted. We do not have a good sense of how much of workforce development money goes into type 1, kind of best practice, this stuff. How much goes into type 2, just being given out randomly, and how much goes into type 3, which is supporting your local monopolists. That's something we're going to try to address in what we're doing. So then there's also, there's lots of anecdotal evidence about other things that might have worked. But let me talk about failures. There are a fair number of failures when it comes to place-based policy. One of the major pitfalls is that when done poorly, what happens is it's just a transfer to landowners, that the policy gets kind of fully capitalized into land values. And so taxpayers are providing money to landowners, and you aren't really changing employment rates in the process. So there's a really good paper in AJ Applied or AJ Economic Policy that looks at Germany's place-based policies along the border, West Germany's place-based policies along the border with East Germany before reunification, in which you conditioned on proximity to the border, and they do a regression discontinuity design about being just inside, just outside. What's the primary difference between two places? Differences in land values, and nothing else really changed. Now, that was also, that was a program which also might have been a dumb program. You weren't conditioning on the right thing. You were just conditioning on your longitude and latitude. You weren't conditioning on local labor market conditions. Another pitfall is that you put money in place and it just gets captured by special interests. And this could be, and so this is different than the first one. First one could be well-intentioned, everyone's doing the right thing. There's just that market forces lead to that capitalization. The second one is a pernicious outcome in which local business says, great, you're gonna put money on the table for place-based development. I've got the perfect project in mind for this. So work by Kaylin Slattery at Columbia Business School, who's gonna be visiting here next year, and Owen Zidar at Princeton. They have looked at using the approach developed by Greenstone, Hornbeck, and Moretti, where you look at 2 US counties that were in the running for a big plant. One wins, one doesn't. And then what happens to aggregate economic outcomes? And their canonical results are that When you subsidize investment in a particular industry, you get more of that industry. You get a significant increase in employment in the thing you subsidize. The impacts on aggregate employment in the locality are null. So you're just replacing one thing for another. And impacts on land values or earnings appear to be null as well. Now, this doesn't mean place-based policy doesn't work, because they could be dumb policies. We could be investing not in distressed regions. We could be investing in richer labor markets in poor states. So there's no, you don't take this as evidence that it doesn't work, just that it can be done poorly. The other very cool result that Kalin has is when do tax breaks to firms locating in a place peak? They peak in year 2 or 3 of the second term of a governor who's incumbent and up for re-election. So you just see kind of the obvious political cycles. And then folks may know about Kansas City's second border war. The first border war happened during the Civil War. Second border war isn't as traumatic, but is worthy of note all the same. So this is Kansas City in the United States, which as a metropolitan area straddles the borders of Kansas and Missouri. Between 1911 and 2019, the Kansas side of Kansas City said, we want to promote Kansas City, so we're going to go recruit businesses. Who are the easiest businesses to recruit? The ones who are already in the city, just across the state border. Let's go into Missouri and let's get these companies to come back. And then Missouri said, oh, no, you don't. You're going to do that to us. We're going to do it back to you. So between 2011 and 2019, there was about $335 million in tax subsidies spent by the 2 states just on getting firms to move back and forth across the border. So the definition of wasted spending. So place-based, if you want to find examples of place-based policy gone awry, they're easy to find. But there are examples in which it is done well, aside from one-off RCTs with active labor force programs, where you're really talking about something that is a strategy. It's not a policy, it's a strategy. It means you're looking across different dimensions and saying, what do we want to be doing with workforce development? What do we want to be doing in terms of helping local firms improve their capabilities? Which firms do we want to subsidize firms to come here? Which firms might we need to provide some inducement not to leave? What sort of collective investments in infrastructure do we need to make in order for this to happen? And an example that lots of people like to turn to is an organization called The Right Place in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Birgit Close, who was hired to run this in the 1980s, showed up as a pretty young professional and at that moment in time to find Grand Rapids in utter disarray. Just it had been suffering from a couple decades of manufacturing job loss, and a place that had been a strong furniture manufacturing center for decades was now deep in the doldrums. A set of business leaders in the area came together and said, we need to do something. And what we need to do is find out how we improve the ecosystem here in Grand Rapids that makes it attractive for business to invest. One of the things that helped is that these 12 business people had significant investments, either in traded or non-traded stuff in that locality. So what does that tell you? Well, they're not multinationals. Big companies may just not care. You don't have something invested in it. So the nature of the industry was there, which gave you business owners who internalized some of the local consequences of what had gone on. And that might not be a necessary condition, but in some instances it might be a sufficient one to get things going. So what did they do? So over the course of a couple of decades, they provided a set of coordinating activities which helped reduce uncertainty to bigger firms and help them understand what Grand Rapids was good at doing. They had to figure out what Grand Rapids was good at doing in the first place. So this is something that Danny Roderick has talked about a lot in his work. How do you, what do we know about industry? Industry is moving between places all the time. So when your industry leaves, what do you do next? It's hard to figure out. So now, don't think picking winners in terms of subsidizing semiconductor firms. Think of Grand Rapids as being a traditional furniture manufacturer. Like, what do we do next? Furniture is a brutal business to be in because it's kind of like the lower end of it is like textiles and apparel. You're competing in the thinnest margins with the lowest wage exporters globally. So they helped firms figure out where do you want to be, help identify the infrastructure that they needed, help them manage the process of getting permissions. And then also on the coordination side, working with regional public universities to make sure they were providing the right skills. So they helped expand the engineering offerings in local public universities. They helped firms in Grand Rapids identify export markets in which they could profitably sell. And they convinced some multinational firms that Grand Rapids was a place worthy of investing in because of its tradition in furniture. And then they also invested in some kind of public R&D stuff. And don't think of this as like saying they figured out where innovation should go in the furniture industry. It's more that you create it's a form of technical assistance in which you're providing consulting to businesses as they're trying to figure out how they upgrade their operations technologically, digitally, and so forth. So in developing country contexts, we're totally on board with these sorts of innovations. The work that Nick Bloom and David McKenzie and others did with Indian textile firms 10 years ago, in which you say you provide McKinsey-style management consulting to those manufacturers. You got long-run improvements. They just did an update to that study. 10 years out, you have improvements in sales and productivity and so forth. This is the same thing. In the US, this gets derisively called industrial policy. It's been RCT'd in developing country contexts. And David McKenzie has recent work on interventions with Colombian auto parts manufacturers. And the wrinkle there is like, how do you provide these things efficiently? Do you have to go in do I have to give you your bespoke management consultant? Because they aren't cheap. Even when you're using MBA students, they aren't cheap. They said, and so they experimented with the bespoke services one-on-one versus group learning. So you can think of this like executive education for business, and the group learning was just as effective as the other. So Danny and I had Birgit here six weeks or so ago, along with some other practitioners, and talking about what she was doing, and said, you have this ecosystem, and it's not a huge ecosystem. So it's an ecosystem. So that ecosystem can get off track easily, and so you're not centrally planning this, but you're trying to make sure that you're providing the things that allow the place to succeed. Now, is this replicable? We don't know. Is there something special about Grand Rapids? There are some special things about Grand Rapids. So it was a place where Dutch immigrants settled in the early 1900s, and they kind of formed this tight-knit community, and they invested in local industry, and you had this kind of nice collection of medium-sized firms. And so they were sticky, right? They had something going on. Within the broader region, there was the city of Grand Haven, which was facing similar issues. And they realized, look, we have firms here, and the problem that the firms are having is not their factory workers, it's the engineers and the supervisors, and that's kind of the middle manager type. We got to convince them Grand Haven is a place they want to live. So a local business owner who happens to be Betsy DeVos's father, as the case turns out, who is Donald Trump's Secretary of Education. So Edward Prince, he said, okay, downtown needs to be a place people want to live. And so, well, how do we make downtown be a place we want to live? So he said, I'm going to make downtown something that's a 12-month-a-year attraction. He put heated water pipes under the sidewalks in the downtown to melt the snow. This part of Michigan, it's in the west of Michigan, it's really snowy. It's not like Ann Arbor, Detroit, which is not as snowy. And they had a Hope College there, which was right adjoining campus. And they worked with Hope College in terms of trying to develop some programming and that would just make the city more attractive in terms of cultural activities. And it's now a place that's, and he spent $250,000 on the heated pipes. There's a great discussion of this in a book called Our Towns by Jim and Deb Fallows. So we can find these examples, and what Danny and I want to try and do is understand are the the Grand Havens and the Grand Rapids are they 5% of cases? Are they 20% of cases? They're not 30% of cases. We know what the average treatment effect of job is. It's bad. We also know there's heterogeneity in adjustment. Some places successfully transition into other activities. We also want to try and understand what are the conditions in these places that allow for that either have the social capital to begin with or allow that social capital to be built. One of the things that we'll be looking at in part of this is how community colleges work. So community colleges in the US, it's the US, everything's decentralized, all of these complicated jurisdictions overlapping and intersecting and conflicting with each other. But in many places, community colleges are quite responsive to what happens in local labor markets. Community colleges do a couple of things. One of the things they do is to help people who aren't quite ready to go to a four-year university get the skills they need to do that. Both my parents went to community colleges and then on to four-year schools. So that's kind of the college track. They also do a huge amount of vocational training. They give certificate programs that could be 6, 9 months in length in manufacturing and repair, in construction, in the classic blue collar trades. We know that in a study done on the state of Michigan, in fact, published in the Journal of Labor Economics last year, you see increases in enrollment in vocational programs when local labor markets see upticks in unemployment, and people are choosing programs that are distinct from the sectors in which job loss is occurring. So we see young people making the right decisions about training. We also know that community colleges are severely underfunded, but that the nature of that funding really varies across space. So one of the things we're going to try and understand is the variation in the quality of community colleges in terms of being able to provide that vocational training as a response, and then try and understand, do places with higher quality community college systems in terms of that responsiveness do better in adjusting to job loss where it occurs. Okay, so I'll close. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A after that with what we're going to do. And what we're going to do, just kind of summarizing what we're going to do is three things. One is kind of on the quantitative side, we're going to track the flow of resources that were into the various buckets of place-based policy: workforce development, technical assistance, tax subsidies for firms, and then specific types of infrastructure development. And this just kind of has to be done brute force. Because it's the US, the Department of Labor does this thing, Department of Education does its thing, Housing and Urban Development does its thing, states do their things. In addition to that, we're working with an organization called Candid, which collects data on what foundations are doing. And at least since about 2010, we want to know the volume of resources flowing from private philanthropy, because they're very big in the space. We want to know, just in terms of the funding, is funding flowing to places that you identify as being distressed, where intervention looks justified based on various theoretical frameworks we have in the books. And not super optimistic here. To take one example just from the Trump administration, I don't want to pick on the Trump administration because that example can be replicated by Democratic presidents before. Trump's opportunity zones, created as part of the 2017 tax bill, provide subsidies for investments in low-income zip codes. There are 8,000 odd zip codes in the US that qualify for opportunity zones. Less than 1% of them accounted for almost all of them. And those seem to be poor zip codes in rich cities. Yeah, and that happened with empowerment zones under Obama and Clinton before. So it's not a left-right thing. It's just a poor policy design thing. So we want to know, are we misallocating the resources that are already on the table? And there's a silver lining to the answer being to that being yes, because it means there's money in the system that can be reallocated without having to authorize new spending. We also want to know about the complementarity or substitutability of funding by state, federal, and philanthropic sources. Do we see them going to different places, to same places, and what's the potential there? So that's the quantitative side. On the qualitative side, we want to understand the conceptual models that these folks who are overseeing economic development have in their heads. And we want to understand the variation in practice across place. Helpful in this regard is that it's the US, and the US is a country of joiners, as Tocqueville told us. So what we have are all sorts of membership associations in which these people belong. So they're all signed up, they have their websites, they're part of bigger umbrella organizations, and that gives us a paper trail in terms of finding. And what we have found in our preliminary discussions, and then also in talking to people who just know this space much, much better than we do, is that civic leadership is really important. Like Birgit Close in Grand Rapids, you don't necessarily need to have, she doesn't have a lot of money at her disposal. What she has is a big megaphone. And she has developed confidence in people in the community that she can help orchestrate a strategy that makes sense. So we want to be able to, we want to try and grade places according to the quality of civic leadership represented by the economic developments that we have. That's really hard to do. So the version of that we actually pull off might be less ambitious, but we're going to see how far we can go there. So this is just kind of, what complicates good practice is this jurisdictional, the alphabet soup of jurisdictions that exist in the United States. Here are commuting zones that we take as our measure of local labor markets. These are a collection of counties in which people live and work. You've got lots of work in labor economics that says it's the right way to think about labor markets. Then we have the jurisdictions that are defined by policy. And so this is just 3 alternative jurisdictions at the federal government level. We aren't even bringing states in yet. Here are workforce development boards. Some states have 20, other states have 1. Their boundaries do not follow the definition of local labor markets. Here are economic development. So this is Department of Labor's definition. Here are economic development districts defined by the Department of Commerce for you to get access to funding through the Small Business Administration or Economic Development Administration. And these geographies are different. And these don't follow the local labor market site. And then we have opportunity zones. These are defined by according to zip codes, and their logic is distinct still. The one thing about this that is actually useful for empirical research is you're going to have this variation in jurisdictional fragmentation across place, which might be huge, and due to just the happenstantial weirdness of how policy at the federal level and state level. So one of the things we want to try and understand is that jurisdictional fragmentation an impediment to kind of effective local leadership goes on. And then finally, as we do all of this, aside from trying to think about estimating treatment effects of place-based policies, we're a little bit less interested in that because so much of that has been done. We're more interested in understanding what we think of as the more central policy question, and that is, if you have the right structures in place, do you adjust more successfully when bad things happen? So the literature approaches this as, what's the causal impact of policy X on outcome Y? That to me is not the right policy question. Policy question is, when place Y has a negative shock, what do you want your values of X to be for good outcomes over the next 5, 10, 15 years? The other question is a fine question. but plenty well researched. And we want to know that both in terms of these economic development operations, but also the other elements of a place, the quality of the community college system. So that's where we are now, and we're hiring and expanding and talking and learning, and we're going to be doing this for the next 5 years. And so with that, I'll happy to turn to questions, please.
Yeah. Question is about the workforce development, especially in areas which are dominated by unskilled workers. So it seems to me that there will be a limit to where you will take them. They will never move from unskilled to skilled workers. So my question based on that, is the solution to try to attract and promote businesses that would employ the maximum number of unskilled workers?
So I want you to think about that. I want to kind of relax the definition of skill a bit and say, to think of somebody who has a high school degree, and they weren't a superstar in high school, but they weren't a dropout either. And now we're thinking about what are the career tracks that are available to that person. So if I can link that person directly or indirectly to a firm that is seeing expanding sales and rising productivity, whether that firm is headquartered there or headquartered somewhere else, what we know is that being employed by a good firm really matters for your long-run prospects. So if I can get that worker with just a high school education, maybe via some extra education and training, into a connection to that firm, either as an employee or as an employee of a subcontractor for that firm, that then puts that worker on this wage track rather than on this wage track. And what that means is that the accumulation of skill and experience and everything else varies enormously in terms of the possibilities that are present. So what do we want that training to do? We want to allow that worker to make that jump. But that's at the level of the individual treatment. We know that that works on an individual by individual basis. What we're more interested in is, does it matter in the aggregate? If I have better systems in place that do that, does that make employers more willing to come in and say, okay, I'm confident that I have access to the workers that I need to grow and develop over time. The thing that the economic development people say again and again and again is that the overwhelming constraint in terms of their location decisions is talent, and talent at multiple levels.
So I have a lot of questions and thoughts because I'm a part of the Wyoming project. So I'll save most of those, spread them out over time. But essentially, I think that we want to maximize the ability to apply what you learn over the next 2 years to try to act on that place. So, but one of the early things that is in the ether is the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and potentially later the Build Back Better stuff. So just wonder if you could say a few comments about how you think about that. If you have any ideas of what could go wrong or what could go right with it, and how does it interact with basically everything you presented here.
We are at an utterly bizarre moment in the practice of place-based policy in the United States as a consequence of COVID, because the US government has put this incredible largesse on the table relative to what budgets looked like before, and money has to get spent. So money's got to get spent. My guess is that the variation in the quality of things that get funded is going to be absolutely enormous. So in the Wyoming context, you have the advantage of Wyoming not being that big, and smaller places tend to get a disproportionate share of the funding, because that's just because they have 2 senators. The number of senators you have matters for how much funding you get in addition to your population. So it's an affine function, and that means they get more than the population would indicate. So that means in terms of thinking about what Wyoming can do, if they tap into the right sources of funding, they can get lots of support. The question is, what do you do with it? So I'll tell you what we're doing in our work, and I don't know if this is going to have relevance for you. So a portion of what we're doing is also looking at places that are going to be disrupted by the energy transition. And the helpful thing here is that energy transition, as I mentioned, has been going on for a long time. So one of the things I'm going to be working on this summer, this paper for the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, is looking at fossil fuel specialized places in 1980, before lots of shocks kind of came down the pipe. And I'm going to be comparing those to observationally similar non-fossil fuel specialized places as of 1980. And then I'm going to repeat the exercise for 2000. So what I encourage you to do for thinking about the Wyoming case is to say, who are my comparators? And the comparators are not going to be like necessarily in Montana. And you want them to be comparators in terms of kind of the non-fossil fuel stuff. That you want to look at the fossil fuel places too, in terms of what they're doing. But you want to know what kind of the time path of these places has been. Because the accumulated history is super important. If you're dealing with local labor markets in West Virginia that had been shedding jobs in coal since 1980, when the coal decline really began in earnest, it's a very different situation than some of the places in Wyoming, some of the coal places. They might, the 1980, 1990 decline, or 1980 to 2000 decline might not have mattered for them. They might have been only whacked since 2010. And so you have less history underfoot. So that's one thing I would look at to understand the comparative economic development in the places you're studying in a clear sense. I would then, I think the most important thing for workers coming out of fossil fuels is, can you get retooled to go do something else? And the worker training and workforce development is essential here. So the quality of the community colleges and other institutions of workforce development is key. We're doing a bunch of stuff on this. Project on Workforce is doing a bunch of stuff on this. We're happy to make our data available for the Wyoming part and to tell you how we're thinking about grading these places in terms of quality. I don't know anything about the community college system in Wyoming or whether it's an important part of training there. But it is the most obvious thing to look at because it's there. It's been doing it for a while, and you don't need to create a de novo institution.
Thankfully, they're heavily interested in expanding the community college network and how to help it work better for the struggling places and the places that they expect to struggle in the future. So it'll be super interesting.
So look at the various projects that the Industrial Areas Foundation have done. They've been doing this in Austin, in El Paso, in the lower Rio Grande Valley, in Louisiana, in Phoenix, and now in Iowa. And you have really different experiences based on what players have done in those places and the quality of local training institutions.
I wanted to follow up about the community colleges. I hear that they're very responsive to demand in local labor markets, but could they also act as a vector for new capabilities to spawn new industries in the way that, like, larger land grant universities are able to do?
I don't know the answer to that question. My first guess would be none, because of what is their MO? Their MO is to take care of workers who are not ready for four-year schools. This could be they need remedial education. It could be their families are just not willing to let them be that far from home yet. It could be that they've got to work part-time and provide some income before they go away. It could be they just haven't figured it out yet. And so they have to serve such an incredibly diverse collection of students that tasking them with being at the frontier is a big ask. Regional public universities are very different entities. The economic developer types, a thing you commonly hear is that people who work in economic development and people who work in workforce development don't get along. Workforce development are producing workers, and they want you to buy their workers. They don't care who, they don't care if you don't want them. That's what is our product, buy our product. Economic developers say, we're trying to close deals with companies. And those companies often don't want workforce development as peddling. Community colleges are different because they're not workforce development, which has a different objective. They can be more effective because they have to work with local employers to make stuff work. They don't, on average, they may not. I have no idea about the Wyoming context, but they're different in that respect. Economic development types also kind of a little skeptical about the value of public universities because just think about the incentives. What are the public universities about? They're not about helping local business expand. That's pretty far down their list of priorities. Now, it doesn't mean it can't happen, but you have to deal with the fact that you're engaging institutions whose incentives are not aligned with the incentives of promoting economic development in Wyoming. What I'd encourage you to do is to look at what the economic development administration has done in Wyoming over time, because they give out grants for technical assistance to business. And they're and at least back to the mid 2000s, it's just all online. And they don't give that many. Their normal funding stream is about $400 million a year. Right now they have $5 billion. Okay. And we have a HKS grad who is working on some.
Okay, nice. Thanks for the tip.
It seems to me like in the US context that the retention or attraction of higher income workers to stay where you are is a really important complement to whatever you do on the business side, whether it's through building more housing or some of the amenity stuff that you mentioned in Grand Rapids. And I wonder, when you talked about earlier, the difference between the focusing on moving people to superstar cities versus focusing on places, is there room to do both, or do we really need to pick one or the other? Because maybe the stuff that Eric Prince did doesn't work if we were able to relax this housing supply constraint in Chicago.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it's and there's ever more murkiness about it. So if you had asked me this pre-COVID, I would have said, man, recruiting skilled workers to smaller towns is going to be really, really tough. Lo and behold, the landscape has shifted a bit. I don't think it shifted a bit as much as folks would like to believe, because cities have operated as cities have for 6,000 years. But we may have, what's happening on average doesn't matter for Wyoming. It's small enough that if a piece of this happens to work for Wyoming, that could be a big deal, and the potential is there. Because why can't Wyoming have its own Boise? You see no reason why not. And so there, it's the research probably isn't going to be that useful to you here, because it's understanding the attractiveness of specific places in Wyoming to the work from home crowd. Now, but realize what you're getting here, because the folks and the policymakers in Wyoming might say, oh, we're going to be part of the tech revolution, the Silicon Range. And that's not what they're going to get. What they're going to get is back office stuff, folks in human resources, folks who do onboarding, folks who provide client services. But that's what Salt Lake City is doing. Salt Lake City is doing that really well. That's what Boise is doing. It's not Austin. They aren't going to get in Austin. But those are good jobs. I mean, attract college-educated workers, and those workers then help create amenities that attract other skilled workers. And it's potentially a very big deal.
You mentioned the bad overlap between local labor markets and administrative units. Do you think the best approach would be to improve that overlap or to centralize administration more?
I don't know. I mean, so let's take a step back and say, think about policy advice we're giving to different policymakers. So if we're talking to the federal government, then obviously coordinating policy across different areas of practice is an important thing. And we don't do that. You have Department of Labor does its workforce development thing. The Economic Development Administration does its thing. Treasury does its stuff through subsidized lending in low-income communities. And then Housing and Urban Development does its thing with empowerment zones and opportunity zones. and so forth. So at the federal level, you want to think about how you coordinate, knowing that what's going to happen is the last thing you want to do is like create a new administration to bring all this stuff together, right? Because you know that that will get blown apart. So you have to understand that the process by which this works is that each of these areas of government has enabling legislation that gets updated about once every 10, 15 years that sets the framework. And you want to think about designing that legislation working in concert with other important complementary areas of enabling legislation. And getting the jurisdictions right is one thing and I just is way out of my area of expertise. But you need to know that Congress is going to want to pull this stuff apart and make sure that a certain amount of money goes in. That's fine. But there's clear potential there. For right now, we don't plan on spending a whole lot of energy talking to people at the federal level because the federal government is kind of shut down in terms of policymaking. So the policy advice that you then give at the state or local level is different because you have to take the federal structure as given. And then the advice is conditional, may be conditional on the extent of fragmentation that you encounter.
I just have a question on like the places that you'll be studying, because it seems based on your example will be mainly like urban areas or areas that previously have like localized like economic activities. But what about rural areas that for like some intrinsic geography like disadvantage, or they just don't have economic activities or like agriculture or things like that?
So we're not that focused on agriculture.
Okay.
Because agriculture employs very few people. But keep in mind that in the US, after 1960, manufacturing left big cities and went to smaller towns. So a lot of the places we're talking about are places that have these broader commuting zones, these collection of counties have 20, 40, 60, 80, 100,000 people. Sorry, you don't need my light for AJ later. A lot of the places we're focused on are smaller places. So is that rural? Well, it's kind of the rural proximate. And it's a different set of challenges than low-income neighborhoods in big, rich cities. We're not really speaking to that. That's a kind of a different pathology. I know we're over time. I'm happy to take another question or two, or
maybe last one from, or maybe we can do it offline.
Yeah, I can wait. Yeah.
So let's thank Gordon again for this wonderful.